As the world continues to grow, populations grow with it, requiring larger and more sustainable food sources to help keep up with rapid growth rate. Though overharvesting certain sources of food, like the oceans for seafood, will cause disruption in the ecosystem and deteriorate the quality of marine life. This process is known as overfishing. Overfishing mostly occurs in or near coastal states or countries whose food supply heavily relies on seafood. Though if the seafood supply is decreased due to overharvesting of marine life for human consumption, then the human population may also decrease due to famine. Not only can overfishing directly impact the lives of humans, but also the lives of marine organisms that are not being targeted by fishermen. The quality of coral reefs is being lessened due to the pollution that large fishing companies leave behind while scavenging the waters for fish to be captured for consumption by humans. Nets used for catching large amounts of small species of marine life, like shrimp, are known as trawl nets, and can get tangled on coral reefs' rigid structures. The fishing companies could remove the nets, but choose not to since it takes labor and time away from contributing to their intended jobs of harvesting fish to sell on the market. Leaving the nets and pollution in the water cause fish populations to decline since their habitats are being destroyed, as well as other food sources that the fish may feed on. The nets can also commonly catch unintended species of marine life like sharks, turtles, or whales that can get tangled up in the nets and eventually die due to cuts and damages dealt by the nets piercing their skin or crushing their bodies. Ignoring this issue will cause overall marine life populations to plummet, causing disruptions in both marine ecosystems and human ecosystems since food chains are being disrupted in both situations. These points mentioned lead me to my overall argument for this video. Although overfishing has become a major issue regarding mostly coastal countries, society must still make an effort to reduce or reverse its effects through fish farming, implementing bagging limits and size requirements, forcing the use of specific gear or gear modifications to help reduce bycatch, and requiring the labeling of fish being transported to help root out illegal fishing among producers. Fish farms are large, typically circular enclosures for fish to breed and live in. Most fish farms are located in large bodies of water, like lakes or oceans, to reduce the impact of their size. These farms allow for the mass production of the same species of fish at a cost of quality. The farms help meet the demand applied to producers from consumers when the large fishing companies producing the seafood cannot provide enough to meet the demand. The fill-in fish may be slightly lower quality, though they are still great substitutes for 100% naturally caught fish. The following interview includes myself and my environmental science teacher, Mrs. Jing, discussing solutions to overfishing, such as fish farming. So, whenever we're talking about overfishing, how would you think that fish farms would act as a solution to overfishing?
So fish farm, they have their own area, right? And then to be able to have certain, like say if they have certain kind of species for them to catch, so that way they have a limit for that area for them to
So it limits
catch.
based on the different species there are?
Yes.
Okay. Mrs. Jing explains that the fish farms can still be a viable solution since they can still produce large amounts of fish, though are possibly limited to the max output of fish based on the species being farmed. If the desired species of fish that is being farmed does not have high reproductive rates, then the whole idea of fish farm is crushed since the fish farms solely produce more fish based on the reproductive rates of the targeted species. According to the Animal Welfare Institute, AWI for short, the farms often depend on wild fish species lower on the food chain, like anchovies, in order to feed the larger carnivorous farm species. It can take up to 5 pounds of smaller fish to produce 1 pound of a fish like salmon or sea bass. This demonstrates that the fish farms are not only restricted by the reproductive rates of the targeted species of fish being farmed, but also are restricted by the supply of food for the fish being farmed, since large quantities of fish require some form of food to continue to reproduce at a rate high enough to meet the demand of consumers. Overall, fish farms are still a viable solution, though must follow specific criteria to be as optimal as possible since they have two major restrictions. Forcing the modifying of certain deer like trawl nets to have a form of escape for large species to escape will help reduce overfishing since it maximizes the amount of the intended species being caught. Modifying gear to reduce bycatch mainly consists of creating escape routes within trawl nets for large species of animals that are unintentionally caught to escape with ease. while not forcing the fishermen to recall the net to remove the captured animal. Implementing mechanisms like this all over the world will reduce overall bycatch rates and help to decrease the amount of disruption of marine ecosystems by humans during times of shrimp catching. The following interview includes myself and my environmental science teacher, Mrs. Jing, discussing solutions for overfishing, such as gear modifications to reduce bycatch. For overfishing, would you say that using specific gear or gear modifications to reduce bycatch will also help reduce overfishing entirely?
It might, but it's hard. Like, depends on how you screen, like how you're going to. For sure, you do not catch different kind of species. Like, if you have a specific screening, like for catching a specific species, and then for sure you won't catch other, and that's a good way, good solution.
That might work. Okay. So it's just like the only downside might be determining which species that you
If
actually.
they look alike, but you don't want to get a cousin species.
Right. Mrs. Jing explains how gear modifications could help reduce bycatch, though if the targeted species is a larger animal, then filtering out the intended large species with another unintended large species may be difficult and prove to be useless. If the intended species were to be a shark, then filtering out an animal like a dolphin or a different type of shark may prove to be difficult or impossible, since the filtering is based on the size of the animal due to the filtering happening underwater and out of reach of the fishermen. According to Jenkins Lakilia, a marine sustainability scientist affiliated with Arizona State University, the jellyball shooter had been used for decades, especially by shrimpers in South Carolina and Georgia, when cannonball jellyfish are so dense that shrimping could not otherwise occur. The jellyball shooter consists of a grid that is placed in the neck of the trawl to block large objects from entering the net bag and directs them out of a hole cut in the net. In her article titled Reducing Sea Turtle Bycatch in Trawl Nets, A History of NMFS Turtlet Sluter Device, TED, Research, published in 2012. A device similar to the jellyball shooter should be commercialized for all fishermen to use when using trawl nets. The device forces large species caught with the bars at the entrance of the trawl up through a space in the net to escape back into the ocean and not clog up the net or get caught and suffer from injuries. Overall, gear modifications could prove to be beneficial, though pose a challenge when filtering out species that are similar in size to other non-targeted species that may be in the same area. Creating or increasing size and bagging regulations will help reduce the amount of overfishing that plagues the world. Implementing size requirements will prevent any baby animals from being caught and killed so that those animals have an opportunity to grow up and reproduce, though will also prevent old animals from being harvested since they are the ones who reproduce the most. Decreasing either old or young age levels of fish will potentially decrease the amount of fish in that population, ultimately leading to the extinction of that species from overharvesting. The following interview includes myself and my environmental science teacher, Mrs. Jing, discussing solutions to overfishing, such as size requirements and bagging limitations. For overfishing, would you believe that size requirements and bagging limits would help reduce overfishing?
Yes, that's for sure.
For sure.
Like now, even though like the fishermen, they have to make sure like certain size, just to make sure if it's a baby, they have to make sure they put it back.
What about if it's too big?
They have some certain like criteria for sure, like to make sure you don't over hunting or over harvesting those kind of species.
So do you think that implementing more of these would help, or do you believe that it's
that will be
doing good right now?
More will be
Better.
More, helpful.
Mrs. Jing explains that size requirements and bagging limits will definitely keep fishermen from overfishing. Large fishing companies must abide by the regulations put in place unless they wish to be fined or even put out of business for not obeying the law. The only possible downside to this solution is that it potentially decreases the overall catch rate of fish, which can lead to fewer fish being sold, though in doing so, it future-proofs the ecosystem by allowing the fish population to remain stable by giving the fish time to reproduce and replenish the lost amount of the population. According to Weidenman John, Assistant Professor of Environmental and Biological Services at Rutgers State University of New Jersey, the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Reauthorization Act of 2006 aims to maintain healthy U.S. fisheries by, among other things, limiting overfishing. In his article, An Evaluation of Acceptable Biological Catch, ABC, Harvest Control Rules Designed to Limit Overfishing, published in 2017. This demonstrates that regulations have begun to be put in place to regulate the amount of fish being caught at a time, but also ensures that the size of the fish is of an acceptable scale. Catching a small fish may insinuate that the fish are too young and must be thrown back, but a fish that is too large in size that is caught must also be thrown back, since fish are too old or too young play a vital role in the reproduction and future reproduction of the fish population. Considering the act was implemented in 2006 and continued through modern day, it makes sense to assume that the law is effective in regulating the amount of fish caught, thus prompting more laws or acts to follow in its footsteps to fully ensure that all fish are of required size to be caught and that not too many fish are caught at one given time. Improving fish labeling systems will help root out illegal fishing, since the labels will now be required to display company names of who caught the fish, who packaged the fish, and who shipped the fish. Forcing all these company names to be on the food label will allow customers to have someone to turn to in case their product does not meet the consumer's expectations, though also provides law enforcement someone to turn to in case they notice that a specific producer is producing a suspicious amount of fish, making law enforcement question if it is possible to produce such a large quantity of fish legally. The following interview includes myself and my environmental science teacher, Mrs. Jing, discussing solutions to overfishing, such as improved fish labeling. For overfishing, would you believe that improved fish labeling would help combat overfishing by rooting out illegal fishing?
It might be like a certain way for sure, but they have to make sure they are very, they can count them accountable, making sure they know where are the resources coming from, and then they labeled it correctly, and then that will help for sure. Like if it's catching too much in a certain area, they can reduce that from.
Because the point of it is to help determine who's producing the most. Because if we notice that there's a lot of extra fish or seafood coming from a certain person, it might help reduce, or it might help us see who that is and help us determine if they're illegally fishing at all.
Yes.
Okay. Mrs. Jing explains that improved fish labeling could prove to be beneficial in rooting out illegal fishing by holding the producers accountable, though is possibly limited by determining the locations of the companies and ensuring that all illegal fisheries are held accountable. According to Mendoza Martha, an investigative journalist with the Associated Press affiliated with the University of British Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, U.S. Deputy Secretary of Commerce Bruce Andrews announced the initiative at the Seafood Expo conference in Boston on Sunday, describing an action plan to stamp out imports of illegally caught fish. He says the steps of the U.S. has taken in environmental stewardship are paying off, but the nation's fisheries remain threatened by illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. In her article, Feds Move to Stop Fishing Crimes by Tracking Seafood Imports, published in 2015. This demonstrates that the United States continues to suffer from illegal fishing and that the fisheries are still being threatened by illegal fishing. Considering this situation has no obvious solution, implementing the improved fish labeling system that I have mentioned could mark as an important step in the right direction to finally end illegal fishing, since doing so may spark others to think of a new solution. Overall, all solutions have their downsides, yet all still remain viable solutions to combat overfishing. Considering the ratio of upsides and downsides, I believe that the best solution to overfishing is implementing size requirements and bagging limits. The upsides are much heavier than the downsides, since the solution keeps the population of fish stable, as well as the human population, while only limiting the amount of fish caught slightly. Keeping the fish and marine life population stable creates a new image of fisheries, since they can keep people happy as well as the environment happy. Thank you for watching.